All right. Good morning again. A lot of new faces today, which is exciting and slightly nerve-wracking. Our main teachers and a couple of our senior students are in Los Angeles. They're going to an event called Chukai-e, which is the 100th anniversary of Soto Zen in the United States. So they're down in LA and it's part of a big full weekend event, which is very cool. And usually when the teachers are gone, they ask some of the senior students to give talks. And so this morning ended up being mine. And what I decided to do, rather than talk about a specific teaching, which is what I normally do, is I decided to do kind of an updated way-seeking mind talk. So in our tradition, the way-seeking mind is just the story of how did you come to study Buddhism? And because I recently embarked on the path of becoming a priest, and that is kind of a new thing, and that transition has been very interesting. I think I thought that I would kind of give an updated version of how that all happened. So and it's been interesting kind of revisiting my life, kind of re-examining it through the lens of the Dharma, the Buddhist teachings, and you understand events in new ways and how things functioned. So I think for me, it has to start with my early life. By the time I was in first grade, I knew what it was to be hit, thrown into walls, burnt with cigarettes. I had ingested alcohol and cocaine by the time I was that age because the family life was like that and those things were just lying around. And I watched my dad try to murder my mother and tried to intervene and got a split lip for my trouble. And I remember being taken to like a water tower my dad was on. He was, I think, probably under the influence of something, was threatening to kill himself. And so my mother drove us out there and was trying to talk him down. And those kinds of experiences, they shape you and they shape your kind of relationship to the world. One of the main truths of the world is that things are impermanent, right? Everything changes. But you can have a very toxic, kind of corrosive relationship to impermanence, where it hurts all the time and it makes you feel unsettled, it makes you feel unsafe, and that becomes your relationship with the world. And that's kind of problematic. And the thing that I grew to know was that violence was always an option. There was no place or time where violence couldn't happen. And that, again, shaped a lot of kind of my early life and my understanding of the world, that violence was always a possibility anywhere you went. Any situation, things could be feeling happy and wholesome and violence could still happen. And that was tough, for a little kid to kind of come to terms with. And I like to think I was smart and I was definitely introspective. And so one of the big formative events in my early life is I remember I was 7-ish years old and out of nowhere, I was watching, I think, the Andy Griffith Show on television. And I had this panic attack just out of nowhere that I was going to die. Like I was going to die. That was real. At 7 years old, somehow like my own mortality was super real to me and terrifying. And I remember my father trying to flip through the Bible that we had to find something to calm me down. And it just didn't work. I was really upset. And that, again, kind of set the pattern for a long time for my relationship with mortality and change and loss, because that kind of early formation was that impermanence was very corrosive instead of life-giving, which it is. Things can only change and get better and progress with impermanence. But if your relationship to it is that it's always scary and nasty, then that makes it hard to make friends with impermanence. And as I have gotten older and as I was looking back on this talk, or on kind of my life and the story, I recently gave a talk on the repentances and karma. And we talked about the twisted karma of the world rather than just our own personal karma. And I got to really kind of look at how what I was experiencing was that generational trauma. You hear that term, I think, used, especially if you're in education, generational trauma. And I know that on my mom's side, because both of my parents were addicts that beat each other up and beat up the kids. On my mom's side, my grandmother was born in Oakland without a hip And so she was abandoned as a baby. And so she grew up in the foster care system. And I believe she loved my grandfather. And I also know that she married him to get out of that system. So they got married very young. And my grandfather was a second generation immigrant from Mexico. And so he didn't have a lot of education. And he was a factory worker for his whole life and was a very good man, provided for his family, but I think he had limitations himself. And so that was kind of the background of my mom's side of the family. There's a lot of kind of chaos and substance abuse in that whole branch of the family. And then on my dad's side, he and his brother, when they were born, their biological dad abandoned the family, just took off and left. And the mom couldn't afford to raise them. And so he ended up being adopted by an aunt and uncle who were abusive, and there was substance abuse. And so it's easy to see how these two kind of broken, damaged people came together, and without a lot of work, you continue those cycles of damage. And so that is what kind of we were born into. And I definitely internalized that damage, and for a large chunk of my life, then externalized that damage. I think it's very easy. My first major relationship was with somebody that maybe I loved a lot and wasn't great for me. And I think loved me a lot, I wasn't great for them. I think that those cycles will just keep rolling if you're not careful. And I see that in my professional life at school. I'm a special education teacher that specializes in emotional disturbance and autism. And when I worked in the inner cities, I would have kids that they knew their probation officer because all four of their older siblings had that same probation officer, and the parents had been incarcerated and out of jail. And you saw, that kind of world momentum carrying them along. And it's really hard to break out of that. And I'll go more into that generational trauma thing a bit later, because you see it expand. And so what I came to know pretty early on is that I knew intimately what it was to be both the victim and the victimizer, right? I know rage and fear and hate because I have, in my time, become very intimate with those things. And there's that quote that our greatest fear is not that we're powerless, that is we're powerful beyond measure. That was my greatest fear, but it was because I was afraid of myself, of what I would do. I didn't trust myself. Having somebody like me when I'm 15 thinking, oh, if I'm powerful, that's not good for the world. That was bad, and so you learn not to trust anything around you, and you learn not to trust yourself. And that's really, really tough. So when I was 7 years old, I saw the very first Karate Kid movie. Are there any Cobra Kai fans? Yeah, right. So the very first Karate Kid movie. And I was entranced by the martial arts, and I was entranced by Mr. Miyagi in particular. What I saw was somebody that had peace, that had it all together. And I wanted that so bad. And so I begged and pleaded for martial arts lessons for my birthday, turning 7. And so I did end up getting into martial arts, and it saved my life. Without the discipline of martial arts, I would be in jail or dead. There's no question. And some of my family and some of my peers from that time are in jail or dead. And so the discipline kept me alive. It kept me strong, but it didn't set me free. And that's, I think, the big difference. I learned how to have very hard control, very hard boundaries, very rigid. And so, because what I thought was that if I became strong enough, a good enough fighter, no one could ever hurt me again. But that's not really how the world works. There is no ultimate badassery that saves you from emotional pain or physical pain or sickness or time. And there's always somebody bigger and better and stronger. That's just how the world works. So it's kind of a losing proposition to try to hang your security on something like that. But I was a kid, I didn't know. And it was certainly better than what I saw, around me. So that was, and that was where I got my first exposure to the idea of meditation. The martial arts class would meditate for 3 minutes before class got started. I'm sure many of us have experiences like that. And I had no idea what I was doing, but it felt right. So that was good. And so that was most of my early life. It kept me, for the most part, out of trouble. My family owned martial arts school. And so I would go to school and then I would go to the martial arts school and then I would go home and go to sleep and just do it again. So I didn't have enough time to get into too much trouble. And then in college, I found real Buddhism for the first time because I didn't know why I was there. So I just took every philosophy and religion course I could find. And so I ended up meandering around and getting a degree in religious studies. And it was good. And I had a really great professor, Dr. Shao, and we were chatting after class one day. And he was like, Mark, you need to go and find a temple. What you're looking for is not in the classroom. You're not going to find enlightenment in the classroom. Buddhism is not something you know, it's something you practice. You need to go practice. It's like, oh, that made sense, right? That kind of keyed in on the martial artist in me. Like you can't just know a technique, you have to practice it until it's in your bones. I'm like, oh, okay, I can do that. So I was in Stockton, California at the time. And so I looked in the yellow pages, because this was a long time ago, don't judge me. And, and I found a Middlebar Monastery, which was a tiny little monastery in Stockton. And I called them up, and unknown to me, the head priest, the Roshi, answered the phone. And we just chatted, and I kind of told him that I was struggling. I had been trying to meditate and it wasn't working, and I need some help. He's like, great, okay, awesome, definitely, come on down. See you at 5:30 in the morning. Like, I'm like, oh, you sneaky bastard. Because he let that to the very end, and then he hung up the phone. And that was McDonald Roshi. He was a scary man. He was very like the samurai style teacher. He no bullshit. He made us do yard work because it was a working farm in the back. And so as much as we meditated, we also worked. We chopped wood, we carried water. I learned how to use a pneumatic wood splitter at Middlebar Monastery. I learned how to roast peppers with a blowtorch at Middlebar Monastery. He was a scary man. And I didn't always like him, but I kept going back because I felt like there was something that was good there. And it was the first time I heard the Heart Sutra was at Middlebar Monastery. And I did not understand a word of it, but I was like, oh, there's, it still rocked my world. I didn't understand it. It was in English, still didn't understand it. But I was just like, there's something very real there. I need to stick around and figure this out. And it was an interesting thing. McDonald Roshi had gotten started with Zen in the 60s, pretty early on, when it was kind of the Wild West of Buddhism. And so people were just making stuff up as they went along. He had studied at the temple in San Francisco that would become San Francisco Zen Center. And so he kind of did a mix of his own thing. So he didn't do a lot of ceremony. Like, we have already chanted as much as I ever chanted at Middlebar Monastery. And he didn't do Jukai, which I'll talk about in a minute. He didn't do a lot of ceremonies. His thing was meditate and then get off the cushion and live your life. Like, he wanted your Buddhism to be out in the world. And I think that had a big impact on how I've always approached Zen practice. It's like, how do we live it? He actually brought up me ordaining back then. And I was like, I'm not interested in that. I don't want to be a monk. And I'd actually had a professor in college, a different professor, not Dr. Shao. I'd said, I really love my girlfriend and I love martial arts and I really like playing guitar. Like, does that mean I can't be a Buddhist? And he was like, yeah, you can't be a Buddhist if you like those things. Like, oh, shoot. Luckily, he was not quite right. So I started studying it at Middlebar Monastery. And that is the time period that I call floating head Zen. In that I had read lots of books and I had my religious studies degree and I could go to the coffee shop and talk about ideas like really smart, but it was all like right here, right? It wasn't in my body. And so I could talk very intelligently, I thought, about Buddhist ideas, but it wasn't changing how I lived my life and my experience of my life very much. I was still angry and scared and miserable and out of balance all the time, even though I knew lots of stuff. So just like martial arts practice, until the thing is in your bones, it doesn't really come out when you need it. And I had some mixed up ideas about Zen practice. I think the most mixed up idea I had is I was like, okay, your emotions, they go up and down, right? You're happy, you're sad, that's kind of life. And I was like, I really hate how I feel most of the time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to clip off my emotional range. Right. So there won't be any big highs, but also there won't be any big lows because I'm just tired of feeling like crap all the time. I'm just going to clip off the highs and lows. I'll just hang out in this like little middle section, right? That's not actually how life works. That's not how human beings work. Turns out that the real thing is you expand your capacity so that you're not knocked around by the ups and downs. You can encompass the ups and downs. But I didn't figure that out for a long time. So about 10 years ago now, I came to Ocean Gate Zen Center. So McDonald Roshi passed away. He was in his 80s when I first started studying with him. And I bounced around the country for a little bit. I was in Seattle and in Portland. And then I came to Santa Cruz and I visited a few different Zen centers. We are lucky in that we are in an area that is rich in the Dharma. You throw a rock, you're gonna hit like 4 Zen centers. And I sat at a few different places. And then I came to Ocean Gate one day and I sat at the 20-minute, Saturday morning thing. And then Jaku, who's one of the 2 main teachers, was giving her Intro to Zen series. So I sat there, I'm like, okay, I know this stuff, but Jaku kept talking. And I just came back the next weekend, and then the next weekend, and then the next weekend. And I don't remember making a decision that Ocean Gate was home. It just kind of happened. And it was interesting because I had no thought process of I need a teacher. But after maybe a year, I stuck around afterwards and I talked to Jaku and I said, I feel this great attraction to you as a teacher. And I was wondering if, we could talk about me becoming your student. And she said, yes, we can definitely talk about that. And so I've been her student for quite a while. And even after that, I feel like I still held myself apart from the Sangha, the greater community, because I didn't feel like I fit very well here. Usually I still don't. I feel like a bit like an alien. You stay and you take part and you laugh with people and you cry with people and you build that community. It happens. And so more and more Ocean Gate started feeling like home. I felt more connected. Jaku ended up marrying Patsy and I. She came out and we got married on the cliffs in Davenport. And after a while, I felt the need to have a more formal connection. And so that's when Jukai happened for me. So for me, Jukai, by the way, is taking the precepts. It's how you officially become a Zen Buddhist, you could say. And so what you do for Jukai, because we have a lot of new people, is you sew a rakusu, and this is Buddha's robe. And the pattern is reminiscent of how in the early days in India, Buddhist robes were scraps that were donated and they would sew them together. And so we sew what's called a rice field pattern, because this is a Japanese flavor of Buddhist practice. And then on the back, you get a Dharma name. Your teacher gives you a Dharma name, and it's supposed to reflect kind of the flavor of your particular practice. And so for me, it wasn't so much about committing to Zen practice, because I felt like I had done that, but it was very much committing to my teacher and to the temple, right? It was being part of this lineage, because you, as part of the ceremony, you fill out a bloodline chart that goes from the historical Buddha through everybody that we know of, down to your teacher, and then you add your name. So it was very much about connection to my teacher and to the Ocean Gate Temple. And my Dharma name is Kenjitsu Gigen, which Jaku translated as Sword of Thusness, Original Source. And I like to think that it's because I'm very like, this, what is this? I want to know what this is. The joke was that I very nearly was named Rainbow Unicorn. Because in my struggles with compassion, I often told Jaku, I don't feel like a compassionate person. And she'd say, Mark, you spend your whole life working with special needs kids. I'm like, yeah, but I don't feel compassionate. It's not all rainbows and unicorns. She's like, well, no, compassion is not necessarily how you feel, it's what you do. So we used to say a lot that it's not all rainbows and unicorns. So my Dharma name was very nearly Rainbow Unicorn. It was also very nearly, because I'm very serious about practice, but I tend to be a little irreverent. I once said to Jaku, what's the Dharma name for sarcastic pain in the ass? And she said, if you're not careful, you're going to find out. So, but that's part of why Jaku and I are such a good fit. Jaku is brilliant. She's super educated. She has a deep understanding of the Dharma. She calls me when she thinks I'm off track, but she has a sense of humor and she enjoys mine. And so we're a really good fit, and I appreciate that. So Jukai felt right, and I went through Jukai. Sewing this took me a long time. I'm not a natural hand sewer. And around that time, Patsy and I were looking for wedding venue sites, right? So we're touring around. And the cliffs out in Davenport, we're out there one day. And has everybody here been to the cliffs in Davenport? High cliffs. So we're out there, and some people above us on a higher level of the cliffs started yelling at us. And we're like, what's going on? And they're like, our friend fell in. And I was just thinking, you have got to be shitting me. And I look out, and there is a body in the ocean bobbing up and down. And I kind of look around, and I'm like, well, shit. So I throw off my stuff and I jump in and I swim out. And this is January, it's New Year's Eve. So I have no memory of the water being cold, but I know hypothermia started descending because my muscles started cramping. But I swim out and I flip the person over, and they're clearly already gone. So I start to try to pull the body back in, and I can't because there's rip ties and stuff like that. And I realize that if I keep trying, I'm going to drown as well. And so I'm like, okay. So I start to swim back in, and I just kind of hit a spot where my body wouldn't work anymore. And so I went under the water, and I actually had time to think, well, now I die. And what was interesting for somebody that had this very corrosive, very fearful relationship to impermanence and death is when I went under the water, I actually was like, oh, things are fundamentally okay. You know, this is okay. Things are okay. The world is okay. And so I went under the water, and I was like, well, now I die. And then I thought, I'm not dying in front of Patsy. That's too fucked up. So that was the thought that came next, which gave me the kind of, I was able to flip on my back and float for a little while, and then swim in, and then flop on the rocks like a beached whale for about half an hour because my muscles were cramping and I couldn't feel anything. And EMS got there really fast because what had happened is Patsy run up the hill to call 911, and then I jumped in the water, and so I got back in. And they got there really fast, and they actually had to use a helicopter. The hills were so steep and things. And they said that he had hit his head on the way down. And even if I'd been in the water there was nothing I could have done. But it was interesting because I'd had close calls before, car accidents and violence and things like that. But that was the first time I'd had time to think about it, like really just be like, oh, I die now. And it was interesting having that more expansive view. Right, because I was definitely still there. I was going to die, but also the world was fundamentally okay in that moment, and so that I think started continuing a shift that's been going on. And so ever since then, and it's been about 6 years now, it's felt like bonus time. Like I shouldn't be here, so everything is bonus time. Getting to marry Patsy is bonus time. Getting to be here talking to you and becoming a priest is bonus time. And what am I going to do with it? What do I want to do with bonus time? And so it's not the things that mattered to me before don't matter now, but you start to think about, like, if, when it becomes very real that you have a certain amount of time, and now I have this gift of bonus time, what's most important? And so I started taking on more responsibility at the Zendo. I was helping teach classes. I'm the official Zoom tech doan, so I have to make sure all the Zoom works. Getting to teach intro to Zen classes, things like that. And a couple of years later, sometime within there, I also, I think everybody, when they sit, especially when they first come to sitting, they're really hoping for those big whiz-bang experiences, like woohoo type stuff. And in Soto Zen, we talk about how sitting is an expression of enlightenment. You are already a Buddha. So when you sit, you are engaging in the activity of a Buddha. And it's also true that sometimes you get to taste the oneness, right? And so sometimes people call those awakening or enlightenment experiences or kensho or things like that. And when you start to have a real feeling of you are everything, your face is everything, that bell is your face, and it's just like looking in a mirror, and you start to, that just becomes more real. It's in your bones. It's not just an intellectual idea. The idea of or for me at least, the idea of my enlightenment or my salvation or my practice stopped making as much sense. And the practice for me started shifting to become more and more about everybody. And around the same time, because I've been practicing for a long time and I had a pretty good academic understanding of Buddhism, and I'm getting a little older, so I have a lot of younger friends, I started some kind of informal mentorships. And So I was, encouraging people to sit and answering questions about how to sit in some Buddhist philosophy. And so again, the expression of practice for me became more and more about serving, which serving other people, which is not different than myself, but it's a little different focus. And a couple people had brought up me ordaining, but there were barriers. In Soto Zen, the tradition is that you go to a long monastic period of training, at the very least an Ango, which is a 3-month intensive at a monastery. And for me, that just wasn't possible. I felt that I would be abandoning my wife, and I wasn't willing to make that choice. And so it became a period of deep uncomfortableness in practice for me, because I felt torn in half, because I felt like being a priest was more and more becoming something that made sense, and I'm not willing to be a bad husband and risk my family's finances to quit my job or go on sabbatical so it was a problem. And so I kind of had like one foot in the door, and it was a nice abstraction of an idea, but that's about as far as it went. And I talked to Jaku about it a few times, and I think she could tell that it was a nice abstract idea for me. And so she never discouraged me. She always said, well, we can talk about that. But she was always very clear that training had to happen, that there was a certain standard that had to be met. And so it just kind of sat there for a little while. But with this mentorship that I was doing and with these classes I was teaching, I realized that the relationship with Jaku is very special. The Jukai for me was really about my relationship with Jaku. Jaku, like I said, she has doctorate. She teaches Institute of Buddhist Studies. She has decades of monastic practice behind her. She's a therapist. Like, she is a brilliant woman. I love Jaku very much. She's one of the most amazing, badass women I have ever met in my life. And my relationship to her through the practice is incredibly important to me. And I started realizing that if anyone ever wanted to have that relationship with me, that I had to be a priest. There are certain ways that only a priest can serve the community. And I wanted to be part of continuing Jaku Zen. So if you remember, I talked about McDonald Roshi. He was very much about off the cushion, live your life off the cushion. How does Zen practice affect that? And Jaku is very much like that. As much as she's steeped in theory and can make me feel like a mental infant in terms of how much Buddhist theory and history she knows, it's very sane, it's very compassionate, it's very grounded. It's very, how do you live your life? And so that I wanted to be part of keeping that going, because every teacher's flavor of Zen is slightly different, just like every martial arts teacher's flavor of the same art is slightly different. Every professor could be teaching the same subject and they make it bring alive in a new way for certain students. So I wanted to be part of Jaku's Zen, keeping that forward. And I wanted to be part of Ocean Gate continuing, because our teachers, they're in their 70s, even if they have another 30 years in them, and I hope they do, maybe they don't want to do this for 30 more years. Maybe they'd like to retire. And I would like Ocean Gate to keep going. So that was all kind of going on. And then I had an epiphany. I was meeting with a former student that went here named Steve and Vicky, and we were setting up our precepts class, right? And Steve was talking about his experiences, and I got really pissed off. I was really angry. And so I went to Jaku and I said, I'm really angry. I'm really angry at the institution, and I'm kind of pissed off at you. She was like, oh, really? Why? I'm like, well, I feel like I'm being torn in half. How do I be a good family man and be a priest? It feels unfair that I didn't figure this out at 17 before I had responsibilities, so now I just can't, right? Am I not able to be of service because I have a career and a wife? And I was really upset about it. And I think that's when Jaku realized that there was some guts to me wanting to be a priest, and not just like an abstract idea of, oh, that'd be nice, like, because I had a very strong emotional tie to the whole thing. And so we started talking about, what does that look like? Because there is no way for me to train in the traditional manner. How are we going to make this happen? Because Zen is a way to engage with the world. That's what Zen is. It's a way to engage with the world. So how do I engage with the world and engage in being a priest in a way that is workable for everybody? And it really started to be the only way. It started feeling like the only way to make sense. And So we have found ways to do training, which got interrupted by COVID, of course. I had these training trips to different temples set up last summer that all got destroyed by COVID. So we'll try again. But I, come to the Zendo more often, and I follow Sue and Randy, who are two Dharma elders, around, so I can learn how to do all the jobs. My academic understanding is pretty good, but I'm learning all the ceremonies and the chants. And then I'll be going to a few temples just to learn how they do it. And then Jaco is going to be teaching lessons, so I'll get to follow her around more and be her attendant. That's part of how it works. And what I have found is that devotion to a way is very different than just practicing it. So I have found this process to be very transformative, as much as I sat every morning and still do, and chanted and came to the Zendo and wore the Rakusu. I still always got to take it or leave it if I wanted. And it's different when you pursue ordination. You are deciding to devote yourself to a particular way, a particular activity. And so it's kind of like, I find, getting married. Patsy and I were together for 9 years before we got married. 6, because it's 13 and 6, 14 and 6. Long time. We were together for a long time before we got married. And so if you asked us like what changed, we could tell you nothing, because we already lived together, our finances were intertwined, all those things. And everything changed when we got married. It was both. And that's kind of what I'm finding with ordination as well. So the other thing is, remember, I was saying I was going to expand on that kind of generational trauma. So in this last year, so I have two younger brothers. One of them is developmentally disabled. He lives in a group home. Both of my parents were on drugs when he was conceived, and so that's a very likely contributor. And so he's close to my age, but functions about 7 years old. And he was allowed to have relations with another group home resident, and they had a child who was born very, very impacted. And so she died at about 12. And so I had to go to that funeral. And then my baby brother, who also, like me, got very pissed off with the world. But I got pissed off and focused on martial arts and got out. He got pissed off and focused on violence and drugs. And so he spent a lot of years as a homeless meth addict. He was gang affiliated. And so he and his girlfriend at the time had 2 kids while they were both under the influence. And so both of those kids are a little impacted. And Joey, my brother, is sober now. He drives a truck and he's a little off. He cooked a lot of brain cells. But we got the call that his youngest son, my nephew, got arrested and is on trial for murder. And so what I'm seeing is, I think all of us were like the center of our story, right? But when you start to see this generational trauma come in and then move past you and expand onto those next generations, you see that you're not the center or the end point. You're part of this cycle that continues. And also this year, one of my best friends passed away unexpectedly. She just died, and we're not really sure why. And so you see, again, for me, this has all been about kind of an expanding, where I understand that my suffering isn't personal in a way. It's not about me. It's, the functioning of the world. And so that, along with things like Roe versus Wade getting overturned and things like that, when I see these things in the world, it makes me want to ordain more. Not because I want to hide from the world, but because I want to be the kind of warrior that I perceive the world as needing. And so, again, Zen is about how to engage with the world. It's not about hiding from it or running away. And so the Soto Zen way feels like the right way to engage with the world and be what I feel like it needs. There's a short parable, martial arts. I'm a big martial arts guy. The teacher says to his student, you talk about peace all the time, but you're always teaching us how to fight. And you probably heard this one, right? Yeah. And the teacher says, it's better to be a warrior in the garden than a gardener in war. And so for me, I really would like to be the warrior in the garden. And Zen, again, is how I do that. And so it's been interesting because, like I said, devotion to a way has been different than just having it available or practicing it. So I've been following Randy and Sue. In a way, I have joined the family business, is how I think of it. I've joined the family business. And so before I go on trips, I ask Jaco for permission. I say, hey, I'd like to miss this weekend or this week, or I'd like to go on this training trip because these things are important. And, Jaco is like, okay, that, we make that work, because it's just like any other family business. You wouldn't just leave and not let your coworkers or your family kind of know what's going on. You wouldn't leave without making sure they're okay. So that's what we're doing. Randy and I were attendants at a memorial service recently, and that was really kind of our first taking part in official functions in a way, in a supportive role. And so it's very engaged. And so along with that has been the sewing, new sewing. Hand sewing is not my gift. I'm not good at it. I don't really love it. So I'm having to sew a new rakusu, and each one of these stitches is done by hand, and there's a chant that goes with every stitch, and it has to be correct and even and small, or you are told to redo it by the sewing teachers. So I've sewed a new one of these, and then there's a big robe called an okesa that is getting sewn, and then there is a zagu, which is a bowing cloth. And I actually am excited about the bowing cloth, because the tradition is that a used piece of cloth is made for the center, right? And so Jaco and I were talking about it. She's like, well, maybe somebody will donate something, or maybe we can get something. And I said, what would it be okay if Patsy donated a piece of cloth? And so Patsy has come with me for the last decade on these fighting trips. So we have gone and fought in Okinawa and Australia and all over the US and in the UK. And one of these dresses that has come along is kind of threadbare and not being worn anymore. And so we have actually cut a center of that dress out, a big piece of cloth. And so that is going to be the center of my bowing mat. So every time as a priest, I bow to Buddha, I'll be bowing with Patsy as well. And I really loved that. And it was a way of, I think, kind of solving one of the tensions, with family life and priest life, and bringing them together. And they're not opposed, right? They support each other. And that's been really, really great. And all of this only matters if it helps us lead good lives. So Zen, Dogen, Buddha only matters if it helps you live a good life, if it helps you live a wholesome life. And to me, if it helps you suffer less and help the suffering of other people. And so to me, a priest is not just a Zen priest or anything else. It's you're a servant of life and death, your own and the people around you. And I think I'm just going to close this, which ran a little longer than I thought it would, is that when I started, I thought that a life of Zen practice was going to be about knowledge. It's going to be a life of knowledge. I was going to learn, I was going to meditate, and I was going to have these deep insights. And I would see that all things are impermanent and empty of inherent existence and interconnected. And I would not feel bad anymore. So this is going to be a life of knowledge. And as I sit and study and have those things, what I am finding is that Zen practice has turned out to be a life about compassion. And that has been, I think, one of the bigger shifts for me. And so I think that's why my practice has become really about service. That's the thing that gets me here every day and gets me on the cushion every day. Is there's no difference between me and everybody else. And so my suffering is everybody else's suffering, and my salvation is everybody else's salvation. And so we all wake up together, and that's become more and more real for me. So I just want to say thank you for listening.